I've become more and more convinced is not going to really be done by like a very narrow climate movement that's like calling for action on climate. It's going to be much broader, I would say, like an anti-austerity movement that's calling for broad investments in public goods and sort of massive redistribution of wealth, taxing the rich to fund huge investments. And a lot of that public goods and public investment agenda is not necessarily going to be about climate. It might be about healthcare and education and childcare and, again, these sort of core public goods that working class people need to live stable lives.
Hi, Matt. Welcome to our podcast. You are a professor of geography at Syracuse University in the state of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote a book about climate change, class struggle, and socialism.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to talk about that during this podcast. But first of all, we are conducting this interview in front of Audi Brussels, which is a car factory that until recently produced electrical vehicles. That is one of the most solar-powered factory or building in the region of Brussels. That has high technology, but also a factory that Audi now decided to close down because even if it made a lot of profit, it still wasn't profitable enough for the shareholders of Audi. So this is a very symbolic place actually to do an interview about climate change, I think. What we are going to talk about is the title of your book. What does it mean? Why do you think it's a good strategy, or what do you think is a good strategy for the climate movement? Mm-hmm. Why class is so important in the struggle? Why we also should look at large industrial sectors like, for example, the Audi factory or other industrial sectors if we want to change our economy, the way we produce and so on. We will even talk about our Belgian government and how they look at public investments. And also, why do you think that unions are so important for climate activists and so on? I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Now, Matt, let's start with the title of your book, which is called Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. That's a very heavy title, but also really thought-provoking, because I always thought climate change is about CO2, it's about science, it's about emissions, it's very technical. You give it a very political meaning. What do you mean by the title of your book? What is class war? Why is it linked with climate change?
Well, when I told my mother this title, she did react in horror because it sounded very heavy to her, sort of a liberal. But I think I'm trying to point out that, as many of us feel very anxious about, climate change is here. Climate breakdown is happening. We're seeing stronger storms, fires, floods. And so that the existence of climate change is a kind of violent war against ordinary communities, and it really disproportionately hurts vulnerable and poor communities. So I wanted to sort of reorient that violence as a kind of class war, because the whole book is trying to argue that the violence of climate breakdown is being perpetrated by a class of owners who own production. And I'm really trying to go back to kind of a classical Marxist theory of class that focuses not really on, so much your income or your wealth and consumption patterns, or even like, your cultural status and your education and things like this, but that really class is about your relationship to the means of production. And fundamental antagonism in a capitalist society is that you have a class of owners who organize production according to profit, and then you have a much larger majority working class who don't own much but their labor power that they have to sell for a wage. And so that for the large majority of working class people, we don't have much power over how our electricity system is organized, how steel and cement and other production systems are organized. And so the real power is with these capitalists who own and invest in these large-scale production systems, and that's really what's driving climate change. And again, you can look at the data about where emissions come from on a global level, and it's something like 70% either comes from how we organize industry, how we organize electricity production, or how we organize agriculture, right? And so all these are productive entities. So the people that own those production systems for profit are waging this war on society, and that's experienced as a kind of violence, right? Through climate breakdown. But I think because of our narratives that you were just suggesting, kind of like it's about science and it's about sort of dispersed consumers, people don't really see it as that kind of class war waged by a small set of owners that are seeking profits. And I think it's very appropriate. We're sitting here in front of an Audi factory that's actually in a sane, rational society would be at the center of decarbonization, climate solutions. It's you suggest it's a solar powered factory. It's producing electric vehicles, and but of course the ownership class that runs this factory doesn't, as you said, doesn't find it profitable enough, so they shut down. Perfectly socially useful infrastructure is shut down because it's not profitable enough. And that's kind of a very good metaphor for the whole climate crisis, because there's so much investment we need to do to solve the crisis, but it's not profitable for investors. So in one sense, the title is trying to suggest that climate breakdown is this class war, but a class war should never be one-sided. It has to be there has to be some ability to fight back and to kind of wage war against the capitalist class. So the book also is really trying to understand how we can build a kind of large-scale, popular, majoritarian working class movement that actually has the power to confront these capitalists who control production.
Mm-hmm. And so you begin your book by saying that we are losing the climate battle with the current climate movement. Can you explain a bit what do you think isn't working in the current strategy? Where does the strategy come from? What are the ideas behind it? Where does it bring us to?
Yeah, and we have to be very sober about the reality we're facing, which is, unfortunately, every year, and I think 2024 is going to, if it hasn't been announced already, is a record year for emissions. Emissions keep going up globally, and as long as that is the case, temperatures are going to keep rising. And there's some debate that we're basically now close to 1.5 degrees, and that is a threshold that has many scientists very worried about increasing levels of climate breakdown. So as long as emissions keep coming up, I would say we're losing this strategy. So the book really tries to point out that our current existing climate movement, because of these facts, is not winning, because unless we start turning emissions down, we're not winning. So we have to kind of think critically about what it is about the climate movement that is not gaining power and not effective politically at moving the needle and challenging the power of the carbon-intensive capitalist class. So what I try to argue in the book is that the climate movement is too embedded in a sort of narrow part of society that I call the professional class, like highly educated people. They come in many forms, but ultimately they make the climate struggle really about two things. One, that it's about the science and believing the science and the truth of climate change, which I think in the media and a lot of the public discourse, climate change is often framed as this struggle over the science that climate change is happening, and do you believe or deny that science? And obviously, for educated people who are well read on the science, they take this very seriously and find it really disconcerting that huge swaths of society sort of don't believe the science or think climate change is something that's natural, not caused by human activities. So obviously this is a problem, but if we could convince 100% of the population that science is real and climate change exists, that doesn't necessarily challenge the power structure that my book is trying to point out, which is that even if we all believe the science, there's still a class of people who own carbon-intensive forms of production and are really hell-bent on, like a lot of these people have invested in natural gas power plants, pipelines, coal power plants. And when you invest in those types of infrastructures, you're looking to make returns on those for decades to come, right? So there's, a lot of sunk capital in the fossil fuel infrastructure. And so no amount of science is going to really convince these capitalists to withdraw those investments, right? So it's part of the struggle, but it's just not really going to move the needle in terms of power. I have a subheading in the book that knowledge is not power, actually, necessarily.
Yeah.
It can be, but and so the other big part of the professional class movement is it often comes from sort of middle upper class people who have a relative material comfort, and I argue that therefore they kind of often look inward towards their own kind of middle class consumption patterns as being the actual driver and cause of climate change, and really sort of focus a lot on reducing consumption and kind of living a low carbon lifestyle and all this kind of stuff, which is fine, and I do this stuff too, but is again very it's not really focusing on the real problem, which really, if you look at kind of the inventory of emissions, it's basically mostly caused by how we organize systems of production. In fact, globally, something like a third of emissions are just coming from in the industrial sector, like actual productive industry, like plants, like factories like this. So no amount of lifestyle changes is again going to really transform not only production systems, but infrastructure systems. This is again really not an individual consumer decision it's like got to be a societal investment program that really rejiggers entire infrastructure systems. Right. And and then even worse, I think the very individualistic virtue signaling around low carbon lifestyles and how you have to be green and reduce consumption really does alienate and annoy huge swaths of working people who you would say are already living precarious lives under neoliberal austerity, are struggling to make ends meet. As the Yellow Vest movement said in France, politicians care about the end of the world. We're just trying to get to the end of the month. And people who are struggling to get to the end of the month, who can't afford their energy bills, can't afford their rent and things like this, like the idea that, it's to save the world means cutting back and consuming less does not resonate, right? It's not something that is going to win over the masses of working people to a kind of climate program, which I would argue would have to actually have an answer to austerity, an answer to the cost of living crisis and the kind of precarity that the majority of working class people endure under highly barbaric and unequal capitalist systems. So.
Yeah. You also talk about the focus of this professional managerial class on market solutions, for example. Could you maybe elaborate on that, and why isn't that working?
Yeah, so that's a particular variant of professional class climate politics I refer to as the policy technocrats. And these are, again, very highly educated people in academia or think tanks or NGOs who are really interested in developing what they consider to be smart kind of technocratic policy solutions. And those, for the last several years, because of kind of the hegemony of neoliberalism, they have tended to promote what are called market-based solutions. So ways that it's basically considered that climate change is a market failure, in that the emissions that all of us, but also industry, are putting into the atmosphere, they're doing that for free, and that these emissions are costs on society. Obviously, we agree climate change is a cost on society. So that the real way to solve this is to, in their terms, internalize these costs into the price mechanism, into markets. And then once you do that, it will magically allow the market to see. So you put a carbon tax on carbon, and then it raises the price of carbon-based energy for not only factories, but consumers. And then the logic is everyone will see, oh, it costs more to consume carbon. I will then shift to low carbon activities. You'll notice like there's no power struggle at all. You just sort of reform the market, and then the market allows sort of smoothly society to transition through these price signals, right? The problem is, again, that while middle class technocrats kind of like this idea because they are, again, anxious about their own consumption and think it's their consumption that's driving climate change. So they think if we could have a carbon tax that would sort of incentivize people to cut back and consume less energy and, turn the thermostat up or whatever it might be, that would be great, because it would, again, sort of incentivize these behaviors that they think are at the core of the crisis. But for working class people, for people struggling in, for instance, like homes that are uninsulated and not well maintained by the landlords who own these infrastructures. Like, again, the idea that we're going to solve this by raising the price of energy, which, as much as a carbon tax tries to maybe redistribute the revenues in ways that could be progressive, they're ultimately saying we're going to raise the price of energy. People are already suffering with high energy costs. We had, in Europe, there's been an energy crisis, and the idea that the core of the solution is going to be raising the price of energy is just, again, it wins over economists. Economists love these ideas of market failures and externalities, internalizing the price of the cost of carbon into prices. But for ordinary working people, this is not a winning program. And in the United States, they've tried to get carbon taxes passed by voters in particular states. The one I've followed is in Washington. They tried it in 2016, 2018. It's a pretty liberal sort of environmentalist state. I mean, and this carbon tax referendum got voted down by voters by large margins in both cases. It's just not a popular approach to climate change. And that's kind of one of the core arguments of the book, that if we're going to win this power struggle, we got to develop popular policies that really appeal to the material interest of majorities of people. And this is certainly not that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these market mechanisms, externalizing cost, ideas like carbon taxes, they push away workers because life will get more expensive for them. But how about the idea of less being more, this kind of idea that, which sounds very logical to me. We need to reduce CO2 emissions, so it needs to be less, but you also have something to say about that strategy. Could you maybe explain that?
Yeah, so we definitely do need to reduce fossil fuel consumption and fossil fuel emissions. I mean, that's the challenge that we're facing with climate change. And but that is I would say it's not a really quantitative. Well, it is a quantitative struggle, but to do that, we need to qualitatively transform the energy system. So, if you were to I was saying earlier, a lot of the emissions are coming from production. About a quarter of global emissions are how we produce electricity, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we were to be, and we know there's many options we can pursue to generate low carbon or zero carbon electricity. And if we were to take that global electricity consumption and move it toward zero carbon forms of energy generation, then you can consume the same amount of energy, but it will be, from a climate perspective, you don't worry about it, right? So you're actually, in that case, all things being equal, you don't have to reduce your energy consumption. You need to transform the forms of energy production to make them zero carbon. Now, there might be a whole lot of other environmental reasons why we might want to reduce energy consumption, depending on the kind of impacts from, for instance, people are often pointing out that a lot of renewable energy takes a lot of mining and rare earth minerals. And so, but just from a climate perspective, what we need to do is qualitatively transform the energy system to be a zero carbon electricity one, right? And so, so with these questions, that often get debated in terms of growth or degrowth, I think it's actually not particularly helpful, because what we have to do is actually degrow the negative parts of the economy, like fossil fuels. I would add like military production and all these sort of really destructive, unnecessary forms of production. And we have to grow the forms of energy production and the sort of socially useful forms of production that we need to solve. So, like I said before, like we need to build a lot of green housing that's well insulated, that's equipped with heat pumps that use electricity for heating systems. We need vast, expansive increases in public transit, right? And so there's going to be, while you are degrowing the bad stuff, you're going to be growing the stuff that is needed to transition the society. So it's, again, it's about a qualitative transformation of what we actually need as a society, and kind of planning that according to the, what the science is saying, and also how we can build systems that actually are meant toward giving working class people more secure and I would say more affordable, and in a perfect world, free access to things like transit, housing, electricity, these basic material needs that are at the core of the climate transition. These are these are the end of the month struggles that working class people struggle to afford every day. So we have to kind of figure out how we can both transform those sectors towards decarbonization, but also aim to really offer cheaper and more affordable options to the working class. And only when we do that will we start to, I think, win over and build a more popular kind of working class type of climate politics.
When we talk about pollution, we often talk about sectors like meat or fast fashion, these kind of sectors, and that we have to reduce our consumption in regards to these sectors. But in your book, you already mentioned that like you just explained how you think the focus should be on production. And in your book, you talk about the nitrogen industry, which is, if I understood correctly, because you explain it also very technically, but very interestingly, it's used to make fertilizers for farmers. That's the main thing. And you say in your book that this industry is responsible for 2.5% of CO2 emissions worldwide.
Yeah.
I had never heard of this industry before. And I never in my life did I ever hear a climate activist talk about it.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's crazy how little that we know about certain industries that play such an important role in carbon emissions. Right. Can you explain this example that you use in your book?
Yeah. So I draw from Karl Marx in Capital, where he does. It's very interesting. He spends the first several hundred pages analyzing commodities and value and how we the prices of commodities. But he eventually gets to a point where he's trying to explain, now, where does this surplus value come from? Where does the profit come from? Because value is based on equivalence, and he eventually tells us to understand where this profit comes from, we got to get out of this market exchange realm and go into what he calls the hidden abode of production. The hidden areas of production, to understand how he tells it that workers are really exploited in the abode of production to create surplus value for the capitalists, right? So it really struck me when I was teaching Capital that climate politics, as we were just talking about, has been totally fixated on the market and on value and exchange and prices, like that we can fix it through value and exchange and prices. And once I started researching fertilizer, but also other industrial sectors, I was like, actually, no, it's much more. We have to go into the hidden abode of production to really think about how to lower emissions on a societal scale. And that shift from the market to production, I think, is really important. But as you were saying, like, as Marx called it, the hidden abode, it is hidden. It's private property. Most people don't have experience of going into a fertilizer factory or a steel factory or cement. And so it's easy to kind of only be looking at life in our daily consumption activities as that's sort of what climate change is all about. So because we could live our lives and never see these infrastructures that sort of underpin our lives, like fertilizer production. And but these are kind of the large scale production systems that actually need to be transformed. And it's interesting with the fertilizer case, because lately, I would say, again, those kind of green technocrats, the technocrat class and kind of the European Union and climate policy circles have sort of really focused their reform efforts on changing the ways in which farmers apply fertilizer, which does have emissions. Basically, they apply the fertilizer and it leads to nitrogen emissions, which are greenhouse gases, and these are bad, right? And this has been their effort at solving kind of the climate problem of nitrogen and emissions, but there hasn't been much discussion of actually regulating the producers of the commodities themselves that do it in these really carbon intensive factories. They could produce fertilizers that were more less polluting when applied by farmers. So there's all sorts of things that could be done to the capitalists that own production, but no one talks about that. Everyone's focused on these bad, irresponsible farmers who are, and then again, just kind of like a broken record, like the yellow vest, what has happened in reaction to these green technocrats has been a mass uprising of farmers. Particularly, I know I've heard this has happened in the Netherlands, but also I think France and other countries here.
In Belgium as well.
Yeah, so farmers are feeling like, you know, the green transition is being put on their backs, and they're angry, right? And again, we do need to restructure farming. Agriculture's about about 22% of global emissions, and that's a huge project. But doing so in a way that kind of puts all the cost on, you could say, a sort of pretty precarious class of small farmers, which, you know, aren't, I would, in technical Marxist term, this isn't the working class, but it's a class that is very sort of powerful politically, that can drum up a lot of outrage and populism. So it's not a winning strategy, right? So I think focusing more on the smaller minority of society that organizes the nitrogen production, and trying to focus on that and how we can sort of take on those capitalists as opposed to the more dispersed set of farmers would be a more politically winning way to go about it.
And why is it that we don't know anything about it? You call it Marx called it the hidden abode of production. Like, why don't we know anything about it?
He said that they put a sign on it that says "No admittance except on business."
Okay.
Which is quite true. If you go to any factory, it's often surrounded by fencing, barbed wires.
Like the factory behind us is surrounded by a fence. Yeah.
And so they don't want you to see what. If a journalist said, "I want to come in and look at what goes on in here," they'd say, "Get out of here. We're going to call security on you." I've done research in a sort of industrial corridor of that's very famous in the United States along the Gulf Coast and the Gulf of, I'm going to call it the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. Not the Gulf of America. That's how Trump decided to call it.
Dear God. Yeah. So in the Gulf of Mexico, basically along the Mississippi River, there's this network of petrochemical and refining and fertilizer factories. Some refer to it that live in the region as Cancer Alley because there's been just horrific pollution and poison of the communities that live, often Black communities, poor communities that live near these facilities. But it's not only that they're surrounded by barbed wire and no one's allowed, but also, like, you know, I have friends and comrades that have been trying to do research in these areas. They're just driving around trying to take pictures and trying to understand, and they get arrested for just trying to take a picture of these facilities. So this is highly securitized kind of zones where, again, it's not only people are not allowed in, but they don't want people to see what happens in there, because it's not only that they're producing a lot of pollution. They're, you know, this is where, as Marx would have it, the, you know, brutal exploitation of labor happens as well. So.
Yeah, they want to hide it. I can understand. I can see why. Also, in your book, you refer to how we electrified society during the 20th century, how we made it possible for millions of people to use electricity in the global north, in the west. And this was also because of huge public spending. Now, in Belgium, we have a new government coalition that has just been formed, the Arizona government, we call it. Because of the colors of the parties refer to the state flag of Arizona. And they have a whole lot of anti-social measures. They want to block wages. They want people to work longer for less pensions and so on. They want to cut public spending. And they want to cut this spending with 22 billion euros. And in regards to climate change, they don't show any ambition at all. They don't treat it as a big urgency. They even want to cut spending in the train network, for example, which is still government owned in Belgium. And you say actually that if we need to fight for accessible and clean energy, that we depend actually on large public investments. So you say we shouldn't rely. You already explained that we shouldn't rely on market forces.
Yeah.
That we shouldn't rely on budget cuts. But that we should massively invest. So is our government on the right path by cutting this public spending?
You know, it's really funny you bring up Arizona, because in 1964 in Arizona, I think he was a senator at the time. His name was Barry Goldwater. and he ran with this very right-wing campaign that was based on a huge critique of kind of the public-oriented New Deal state. You know, he was all about free markets and just gutting and deregulating public systems and vastly downgrading the public sector in general. And he lost very dramatically in 1964, but many say that was the origins of the kind of neoliberal turn in American politics that led to 16 years later the election of Ronald Reagan and the kind of, you know, Thatcherism and the kind of neoliberal turn that did focus on really demolishing a lot of these public sectors, privatizing them, deregulating these systems so that they can be more geared towards profit. And actually, the electricity sector is sort of exhibit A of how that all happened. You know, in the 20th century, electricity was often, even when it was privately owned, it was organized through highly regulated forms of what are called public utility laws that really constrained how these systems were operated and sort of considered them an essential service, kind of like water that kind of people should be able to count on, and that people weren't charging too high prices. And so it was highly regulated. And then this neoliberal revolution really said, well, why not allow markets to drive this system more, be more efficient? We could save money and so forth. So starting in the 1970s, you move toward the deregulation of electricity, and you start to break up these utilities into smaller, what are called independent power producers that are just sort of these capitalists that can produce electricity unhinged from the larger public utility system. And so basically now, after decades of deregulation, we have a highly kind of fragmented electricity sector where they're sort of trying to organize this highly complex infrastructure where, you know, like in an electricity grid, like supply and demand always have to be in balance, and you need to plan the system kind of like at a Soviet level. But yet they're trying to kind of run these what are called auctions or markets that kind of allow independent power producers to sort of compete on these markets to sell electricity into the grid. And in terms of decarbonization, it's almost like we don't even know where to start because the system's been so fragmented. And so, yeah, I think resurrecting that kind of public utility ethos and the electricity sector would be a starting point for kind of the politics we need to bring back. But as you suggested, it's not just about electricity. It's about housing. It's about transport. It's about huge levels of investment in public services and public goods. And to me, that's why I think to do something as broad and societal as decarbonization, it's actually, I've become more and more convinced it's not going to really be done by like a very narrow climate movement that's like calling for action on climate. It's going to be a much broader, I would say, like an anti-austerity movement that's calling for broad investments in public goods and sort of massive redistribution of wealth, taxing the rich to fund huge investments. And a lot of that public goods and public investment agenda is not necessarily going to be about climate. It might be about healthcare and education and childcare. And again, these sort of core public goods that working class people need to live stable lives. But you can see easily how climate can be brought into that larger anti-austerity public goods agenda. Because again, I think the core problem is that capital is not willing to invest in the things we need to decarbonize. It's only going to be public sector investment that can invest with other criteria in mind besides profits, right? Because if the public owned this Audi factory, they would probably reopen it because it's got use value. It's got all this useful infrastructure that could be put to social use. And that's kind of the kind of spirit of public investment that was powerful in the middle of the 20th century that we've completely kind of lost. Another problem is a lot of this infrastructure is what is termed like long-term infrastructure that capital is just not interested in building things like highways or sewage treatment plants or public transit systems, because those are things that don't really pay off immediately to capital. So it's always been the state that takes on these kind of long-term infrastructure demands because capital doesn't find it very profitable to do so. But to get there, we really have to really combat the the rich capitalist class who have just done nothing but made sure that they don't have to pay taxes, made sure that their wealth is protected from the public coffers. And so that it's a really kind of, again, a class war against not just the carbon intensive capitalist class, but the whole capitalist class that is, you know, hoarding their wealth. And so it's going to be this sort of mass anti-austerity politics against them.
Okay, great. About the last chapter, maybe in your book, something that really struck to my mind was you explain what you answer when one of your students asks you what they can do for the climate. And then you tell them to join a union. But I thought unions were about wages, pensions, workers' rights, you know, or life in the factory, how to improve it and so on. So that's not a common answer.
Yeah.
Why are unions so important in the struggle for against climate change?
Well, again, I try to reframe the struggle as a struggle against capital in general. And I come from a philosophy of Marxism that says that there's really no other social force in society but labor and but the working class that can really build a kind of countervailing power against capital. And that historically, really, it's been when the working class and the labor movement are strong is when you see like what we were just talking about. You're going to see large-scale redistribution of wealth. You're going to see large-scale investment in public goods when labor is strong, when the working class is strong, right? And so I would argue it's no accident that we've seen nothing but sort of, you know, austerity and scaling down of the public sector and privatization of the public sector. It's been at the exact moment that the working class has been defeated or downgraded in its power over the last several decades. So essentially, I think I come from a point of view that basically, again, not just climate, but anything we want to accomplish as a left or as movements starts with a strong labor movement that has this really very strategic power in the fact that in these hidden abodes of workplaces, they do the work and they can withdraw their labor. They can go on strike. They can basically materially create a crisis that forces elites to pay attention. But as you said, you know, there is a risk that you can have kind of a, you know, what Lenin called a trade union consciousness, where union members become, you know, a little narrowly focused on their own wages, their own material betterment, and trade union struggles can be kind of not looking at the broader kind of political needs of society. So it's not like automatic. A stronger union movement means you are going to, you know, build this kind of political anti-austerity movement. So there has to be a way to channel the power that unions have, the power that workers have, and the power that the labor movement has into not just economism and economic struggles, but to translate those into political demands, political programs that center taxing the rich, investing in public goods. And I think if you combine that kind of political program focused on those things with the strategic and power that workers in the labor movement have through unions, then you have a nice combination. So that's where I see we have to go in this sort of struggle against capital.
Great. It's good that you say this because now in Belgium we have a big social movement led by the trade unions, but also civil society organizations, the student movement, pro-Palestine movement and so on, all coming on the streets against this anti-social government. They will do a national strike on the 31st of March.
Yes.
So to fight for real change in climate policy, we have every interest, I believe, in engaging also in this struggle against this government. You know, for joining this huge social movement and pushing for change. I think that's a good way to wrap up a conclusion for our talk. Where can people buy your book if they want to know more?
Well, I know it was recently translated into Dutch.
Yeah.
By, I believe, the publisher's EPO.
Yeah, EPO. Yeah.
EPO.
Yeah.
So if that's your language, you can pick it up there. Otherwise, I think in Belgium, if you go to Verso Books, you can have it. I know sometimes it gets complicated shipping, but I know it's available in the UK and it has to be sort of shipped through customs, and it can be
Yeah.
done. I think you did it somehow. So
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, we'll definitely put the link where you can buy the book in the description of the podcast. So thank you for this very interesting talk, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. And we will definitely remember what you wrote down in our struggle for against climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.